Hello, I am Dr. Abbas Shaberi, and today I will be talking about Do You See Me? Paintings of Levator Ani Trauma and Healing. Please feel free to live stream and spread the word. Also, remember if you have had personal history of post-traumatic stress disorder, this talk may be triggering for you. Miss Rosie towered over me and lovingly said, "Remember, Abbas, childbirth is like walking through a field of daisies. For some mothers, it is as if mines go under their feet or mortar explodes next to them. We all rush in to help, but they are all dazed and disoriented, and to them, we may look like shadows, and all we do may seem intrusive and traumatic." One could not ignore Miss Rosie. She was a tall, imposing woman with reading glasses that hung from her nose as she looked down at you with quizzical eyes. She had been a nurse at the Charity Hospital of New Orleans longer than I had been alive. I did not know, but in 1994, when Miss Rosie used this analogy of comparing a laboring mother to a soldier on the battlefields, it was about the same time that the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, or DSM, recognized childbirth-related post-traumatic stress disorder as a diagnosis. Such was my introduction to the world of trauma and mothers as a brand new, fresh intern. When you look at the US morbidity and mortality, you see that the United States has the highest morbidity and mortality in the developed world. In the United States, 1 out of 4 deaths are due to mental health disorders. 22% of deaths occur during pregnancy, 25% occur on the day of delivery or within 7 days after, and 53% occur between 7 days to 1 year after pregnancy. When we look at who amongst our women is most harmed, you can see that the pregnancy mortality rate is the highest amongst Black women and minorities. Not only the mental health disorders are prevalent and costly, they're also most undertreated in vulnerable populations, including persons of colors. How well are we doing in the United States in managing these conditions? Well, based on the first comprehensive view into the state of maternal mental health disorders, altogether we are getting a score of B in California, but the rest of the country is really getting D's and F's. So we are not doing well at all. Most states manage to get a score of D on the report cards, and this is for conditions that are easily discoverable, such as depression. Here, I want to talk about a hidden epidemic, postpartum post-traumatic stress disorder related to levator ani trauma. The levator ani muscles are the hidden muscles of the pelvic floor, responsible for the support of pelvic floor and the other vital functions such as urination, defecation, and sexual pleasure. Women may take these functions for granted, but when they don't happen, the patients become miserable. So what is post-traumatic stress disorder? PTSD is an anxiety disorder that develops due to physical injury or severe mental or emotional distress, such as military combat, a violent assault, a natural disaster, or another life-threatening event. When Miss Rosie, my nurse, spoke to me, we knew what PTSD and childbirth were, but we had never connected the two entities. As a society, we were raised to think that birth happened in private rooms, hospitals, or nature under a tree where beautiful sun rays warmed the mother and her new baby. Not much has changed regarding our understanding and expectations of a mother's experience during labor since 1994, when Miss Rosie talked to me, or for that matter, since 1894, 100 years before she talked to me. Many, including healthcare professionals, confuse postpartum PTSD with postpartum depression. Mothers with postpartum depression don't suffer from intrusive memories or flashbacks. PTSD after childbirth is like the PTSD experienced by warriors of Iraq or Afghanistan. Normal individuals have occasional nightmares and then wake up to the comfort of reality. For new mothers with PTSD, there is no respite. They wake up from sleep to experience constant, unrelenting nightmares and flashbacks. If you ask a mother which days in her life have burned into her memories, undoubtedly you hear the birth of my child. On the one hand, giving birth is a raw, bloody, painful, and life-threatening experience. On the other hand, it is amazing and unimaginable. It is the moment you claim victory by battling nature and bringing a new life to this world. After 9 months of perseverance, in less than 24 hours, you have fought, felt excited, angry, tired, anxious, joyful, and relieved when you finally hold your crying baby in your arms. Of all the emotions experienced, grief is not one emotion that you would typically associate with healthy childbirth. A mother may come home with a big smile, holding a bundle of joy. She dreams of a house with her partner, which would become a home with the introduction of a baby. But for some, this dream is not realized because of PTSD. I will not go into the details of her childbirth, but for her, the delivery was as if she had just returned from a war where she had expected a field of flowers and daisies and instead been dazed and numbed by the incoming mortar rounds. If you went through a childbirth experience that resulted in PTSD, your mind may be blurry about what happened. You're trying to recollect through a haze of what you consider to be hormonal swings and a tsunami of bodily changes. You know you love your new child and partner, but cannot connect with those feelings. You blame yourself for not being tough enough, feeling too much, and remembering so little. Every time your partner leaves you, you're afraid something terrible could happen to you. You do your best to help latch on the baby, eat, feed, clean, and carry on as before. You crawl to the safety of your bed to process the birth events when you can and hope for sleep when the flashbacks are not haunting you. In the space between sleep and awareness, pictures pop up in your mind. A nurse, a doula, a doctor, someone is screaming, someone asking for help, a bitter smell of your own bodily fluids, the clang of the metal instruments, you on a gurney being rushed through the hallways, the rapt, comforting cry of the baby on your breasts. A friend comments on a selfie you took at the moment, but you don't remember. You don't know why you would have taken a selfie. Was this the special moment that you always dreamed of? Were you afraid, or did you believe you or your baby were about to die, and you wanted to capture that last moment? Your pre-delivery self finds the whole thing absurd. You may feel indignant, disrespected, or appalled. You never thought childbirth could come at such a high price to you, but that was your former self. Your new self feels like she has had an unreal, out-of-body experience. Sometimes you feel helplessly terrified and flooded by tears and anxiety, and re-experience a total lack of control. You have visions of people you don't recognize examining you and causing you pain during labor. The visions come to visit you at odd times while you're awake during your daily activities. You feel sore, tremendous pressure when you stand, or leak urine when you move. At first, you thought all this was normal, but it has been weeks since you delivered and things have not improved. You ask your mother, sister, and friends how the birth process went for them. Fine. It was beautiful. What did you expect? Hope slips through your fingers. You feel you live in an alternate universe where no one else has had your birth experiences. You start doubting yourself. Now it has been months since you delivered. Am I an inadequate mother? Is this postpartum depression they talk about? Was my body wrong for a woman? You know something is physically wrong. After all, you refuse to go to grocery store because you cannot stand up for more than 30 minutes. The pressure you feel in your pelvic floor and genital area cannot be put to words. You feel like there's a hole in your bottom, and you have to pay attention to every move and every posture as if in a balancing act, so your insides won't fall out. Your doula and your doctor told you the birth went as expected. It has been a year now since you delivered. You have seen many doctors, including your gynecologist, who have different opinions. Your partner pushed you to see a therapist. The therapist told you that you are depressed. You took antidepressant and it didn't help you. You told the therapist that something was physically wrong, but no one could find the problem. It is not that you cannot do the things that you love, such as running or taking strolls. You grieve the fact that you're not able to do the normal things, such as having a bowel movement, changing your baby's diaper, or carrying your baby when it cries. You grieve your old self and cannot celebrate the new person you have become. You grieve the fact that your partner believes you're avoiding intimacy. You grieve that your vagina feels numb and has lost all sensations. You deal with grief by burying it, locking away the visions from the birth deep in your heart. So you too can say the birth was fine. It was beautiful. What did I expect? Even as a medical student, I was amazed at just how little was known about women's pelvic floor anatomy. During my early training years as an OBGYN resident at the Charity Hospital of New Orleans, I witnessed that even visible physical injuries to the perineum and anal sphincter were repaired inadequately because they did not understand the anatomy. Our lack of understanding of basic pelvic floor anatomy prevented us from diagnosing the deeply embedded invisible pelvic floor muscle trauma that followed the mother home, and prevented us from advancing science and extending help to these mothers. This lack of understanding of basic female pelvic floor anatomy prevented me from connecting the dots between patients' levator ani injuries and physical symptoms of pain, pressure, and discomfort, which went hand in hand with an ocean of psychological trauma swooping through their souls. Remember, back then, levator ani trauma was not discovered yet. I spent the next 30 years investigating and elucidating levator ani anatomy, creating methodologies to visualize the levator ani muscles using imaging, teaching how to visualize the injuries by bedside ultrasound, and how to repair them to relieve the patient's symptoms. Meanwhile, when I saw a patient in my office, it was not difficult to diagnose PTSD. As many as 1/3 of women rated their delivery as traumatic, and approximately 6% of these women met the criteria for postpartum PTSD. Some of my patients had recurrent, involuntary, and intrusive, distressing memories of the traumatic birth, such as metal scraping of forceps, instruments, smell of the baby, body fluids. Some had recurrent distressing dreams about childbirth. Some had dissociative reactions and flashbacks. There was intense or prolonged psychological distress at the exposure to internal and external cues that symbolize childbirth for some. It was hard for some patients to avoid or make efforts to avoid distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings about the childbirth process. They avoided or made efforts to avoid anything that had to do with childbirth. Some of my patients were unable to remember important aspects of the birth as they had developed dissociative amnesia. Most had persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs or expectations about themselves, such as believing I am bad, no one can be trusted, the world is completely dangerous, my whole nervous system is wrecked. And they often blamed themselves or others for what had happened. Some of the patients were irritable and angry with no provocation, and some engaged in reckless behaviors and self-destructive behaviors. By the time my patients saw me, was an average of 8 months since delivering their babies. So it was much longer than the 1 month required to make the diagnosis. It is true that adverse childhood experiences can affect our responses to trauma and make an individual more prone to mental health issues. It is also true that in general, the communities where poverty is prevalent and there is a lack of access to optimal educational opportunities for women, employment, healthy food, and sufficient housing can increase the risk of adverse childhood experiences. But when we looked at my patients who had PTSD, we could see that they may not have had any predisposing psychiatric disorders. They may not have had previous trauma. They may not have had realistic expectations of what the childbirth was like. And they were generally competitive women who were having their first deliveries. And then during labor, they were often either in prolonged or very rapid deliveries. They had loss of control and lack of consent. They had emergency C-sections, forceps or vacuum deliveries. And after delivery, they had intrapartum events that were unexplained to them. They lacked a physical diagnosis of trauma, and they ruminated on the experience, and they had poor medical team support. While it was clear to me that patients had post-traumatic stress disorder, their statements and behaviors perplexed me. Again, remember, this was before we knew levator and eye trauma existed. New mothers with pelvic floor trauma confided in me their emotional distress, but I did not know that they had pelvic floor trauma. I did not understand why women with no injuries were complaining of these issues. And once we started doing ultrasound, I did not understand why women with identical levator and eye traumas on ultrasound had different emotional responses. After many years, I realized that my patients' sensitive, intimate, and personal and heartbreaking stories resemble those of patients in various stages of grief cycle. The PTSD response after childbirth was like recovering from a loss as the patients mourned capacities and functionalities that were now dead to them. As I developed methodologies to diagnose levator and eye trauma with ultrasound, I connected further dots that it was my grieving levator and eye trauma mothers who felt the saddest, the angriest, most neglected and uncared for and unheard. Some of my patients had suicidal thoughts since their voices were unheard. Postpartum PTSD quieted its victims, and it was not easy for patients to talk to someone in a white coat. I recognized similar patterns in their stories as I inquired, probed, and earned the patient's trust. Then something magical happened. I realized showing levator and eye trauma on ultrasound screen to my patients helped them face their PTSD symptoms, relieve their anxiety, and dissipated their sadness. For the first time in their long journey, they had been given a sensible reason for their physical and psychological symptoms. Feeling validated, they could measure up the problem and make long-term plans. I knew how to advocate for my patients with my science. Medicine had always been my art, I wondered if I could make my art my medicine. I took patients' typical statements and matched them with 24 stages of grief and healing and decided to paint each single stage. My goal was to create a visual journey through my paintings for the care providers and the general public to journey in the shoes of a new mother with postpartum PTSD, and for them to experience the shock, denial, anger, depression, detachment, dialogue, bargaining, acceptance, and return to a meaningful life that a pelvic floor trauma mother experienced. A mother may experience one or many of these stages in varied sequences. I must stress, as a specialist, when we lack the capacity or the competency to diagnose a mother's underlying physical reason for PTSD, she will be stuck in one of those destructive stages, such as constant anxiety or fear for the rest of her life. She's unable to progress and to return to a meaningful life. This has become very clear to me, as during my painting exhibitions, a patient who delivered 30 years ago would come to a complete stop in front of a painting where she was emotionally stuck and release the tears she was holding for the past 30 years. The story of women with levator and eye trauma and PTSD was untold. If, by conservative estimates, 13% of women have levator and eye trauma and 3% of them have PTSD, this translates annually to about 100,000 women in the US alone who go untreated because their injuries go undiagnosed. And the physical therapists and mental health professionals do not have a causative diagnosis to work with. Through opportunities such as this and exhibitions, providers and the general public understand the impact of levator ani injury and its maternal mental health consequences. I'm a physician and I'm a painter. I use all my tools of social media, ultrasound, paintbrushes, and robots to bring healing. The garments I wear in the operating room and in the painting studio are the same. The tools are different. By performing tactical levator ani repair in postpartum patients, I hope to relieve their physical trauma. Together, we should advocate for levator ani trauma patients by advancing science and by providing evidence-based diagnostic algorithms and surgical solutions. A firm physical diagnosis will assist our physical therapists and mental health professionals to better attend to these patients. By retelling my patients' stories in paintings, I hope to open their psychological wounds and help them heal. I hope I have helped you to hear these patients' stories and to go on to retell their stories and become their voices. Thank you for paying attention. You can find further resources either on social media at Shoberi Art about my art, or at Dr. S.A. Shoberi about questions about levator ani injury, or look at my website. Please feel free to email me with any questions at shoberiart@gmail.com. And you can also find further resources such as books about the exhibition and the solutions that I provide. Thank you.